when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
On August 28th, 1963, at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., a political rally known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was organized by a number of civil rights and religious groups. This event was designed to shed light on the political and social challenges that African Americans continued to face across the country. The march, which became a key movement in the growing struggle for civil rights in the United States, was epitomized in Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. The Big Six organizers of the March on Washington were James Farmer, John Lewis, A. Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, Whitney Young Jr., and Martin Luther King Jr. These leaders joined together in order to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation and to continue protests that began in 1957 and 1958, which had not achieved their goals. The protests included the high levels of black unemployment and the persistence of racial segregation in the South. Due to these marches, desire for a large-scale march for economic and political justice led to the March on Washington to protest these atrocities. The significance of the March on Washington was that it saved the civil rights movement. It inspired and focused people at a time when anger and frustration threatened the sense of hope and nonviolence that had channeled the civil rights movement. The previous year had been hard on the movement. Governor George Wallace of Alabama had personally tried to stop the racial integration of the University of Alabama. Martin Luther King Jr. had been thrown in jail in Birmingham, and the civil rights leader, Medgar Evers, was murdered outside his own home. Although King's speech, in particular, turned the anger and frustration that many people felt into a sense of empowerment and hope. If the march had turned violent, it could have been the end of the civil rights movement itself, but because of its success, it catapulted the movement forward. King's famous speech was a message to the nation, but his immediate target were the lawmakers in the crowd who would vote on the Civil Rights Bill in the House. Although the march didn't change the minds of Southern Democrats or Allied Republicans, it did help to build support among young whites for a civil rights revolution that would transform America's law and politics. After the march, King and other civil rights leaders met with President Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson at the White House, where they discussed the need for a dual-party support of the civil rights legislation. Even though the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were passed after Kennedy's death, they reflected the demands of the march and demonstrated the impact that the march had politically. Differing viewpoints of the march came from a variety of people, including President Kennedy, who originally discouraged the march for fear that it could make the legislature vote against civil rights laws. Once it became clear that the march would go on, however, he supported it. Outright opposition came from two sides. White supremacist groups, such as the KKK, were not in favor of any event supporting racial equality. On the other hand, the march was also condemned by some civil rights activists who thought it did not represent a correct idea of racial harmony. Malcolm X called it the farce on Washington, and members of the Nation of Islam who attended the march were temporarily suspended. The march was an unprecedented social success. Both black and white Americans had joined together to share a joyous day of speeches, songs, and prayers in the name of equality. Martin Luther King's soaring address finished off the day, and his phrase, "I have a dream," became an expression of the highest ambitions of the civil rights movement. Due to King's exceptional speech and the determination of both black and whites, the March on Washington will be forever remembered as a stepping stone for a greater democracy and equality in America.
White boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.